follow the gray brick road.
They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. I don't know who specifically says that, certainly not anybody I know or talk to. Maybe it's a boomer thing, I don't know, who cares? In Viewfinder, a trippy perspective-shifting first-person puzzle game owing much to the likes of Superliminal or Manifold Garden, a picture is more of a tool and a core conceit that's just original enough to let it conceptually stand on its own. In a sense, this is a photography game, but one requiring you to forego any aesthetic preferences for your photos in favor of a more practical approach. And that's because none of your two-dimensional photographs stay that way for long. Position them using the left trigger and place them using the right trigger, and your photo will imperceptibly vanish, instead superimposing itself in three-dimensional space wherever you placed it, erasing what was originally there in the process. The function of this becomes immediately intuitive. Take a picture of a pillar, rotate it sideways, and suddenly it becomes a platform to get to a previously unreachable part of the level. Photograph a battery you need that's high out of reach and magically place it closer to the ground so that you can grab it. Or snap a shot of the teleporter that lets you complete the level and place it somewhere you can actually reach it. It's at once wonderfully creative and trippy as hell, requiring a bit of abstract thinking to really figure out what you're doing. It's also just a beautiful game. Every level of Viewfinder is brilliantly colorful, blossoming with vibrant flora and filled with books, furniture, and tchotchkes of all kinds. And while its visuals probably won't be winning awards for fanciest 4K textures or most realistic grass swaying simulation or whatever, clearly a lot of love has gone into Viewfinder's art design. And for a company with seemingly no prior releases, Sad Owl Studios has done an exemplary job optimizing the game and adding some bells and whistles that are often taken for granted these days, even by major releases, or I guess especially by major releases. Ultrawide support is phenomenal, with the game running flawlessly at a 32:9 aspect ratio for those of you preferring to have an eyeball-melting field of view. I also tried Viewfinder out on the Steam Deck and happy to say it runs basically perfectly at a near-lock 60 FPS from the moment you boot it up. There are some frame drops in busier areas like when it rains, but these aren't too noticeable and don't impact the gameplay at all. The game has some accessibility settings worth going over as well. There are options to change the fonts and font size for better readability, an option to help those with photosensitivity issues, the ability to change crosshairs or field of view, and a toggle to disable any timers that go with the handful of time-sensitive puzzles in the game. You can also change key bindings and toggle a small range of graphical settings like resolution scale, depth of field, and anti-aliasing. If there's one little thing that bugged me about Viewfinder's visuals, it's that it suffers from a slight micro stutter that some Unity games seem to have trouble with. I didn't really notice it on my Steam Deck when running at 60 FPS, but on my desktop at higher frame rates, it was apparent if I looked hard enough. It's a really minor thing, but something I would certainly like to see the devs address. Sound design is pretty good too. Viewfinder's voice acting is mostly solid across the board, and while the music can be generously described as an indistinct mishmash of tunes you'd hear while getting a massage at a high-end spa, it fits with the game's elegant, bright environments well enough. Viewfinder's main story takes place over the course of 5 hub areas filled with teleporters that take you to groups of puzzle levels. It starts simple, with you picking up photographs placed throughout the environment or taking them yourself using stationary cameras, but eventually ramps up to give you access to a camera of your own with limited film or even a photocopier to be able to use the photos multiple times. Some areas may forego the photography entirely and instead rely on some neat visual illusions that will be certain to confuse your senses, but in a good way. Many of the puzzles may be as short as a minute or so, as the game is constantly introducing new mechanics for you to get to grips with. I like some of the puzzle elements more than others, but they generally do a good job of mixing things up and requiring you to think a bit. I got a bit stuck once or twice on the main levels, but overall they're not too tough and are designed to keep you moving with a reasonably helpful hint system accessible via the pause menu if you truly feel lost. Each hub world is scattered with optional levels though, and these tend to provide a much more interesting challenge, often using core mechanics in unexpected ways and requiring you to think outside the box. But especially on levels where you have your own camera to take photos with, puzzles can feel open-ended and require some creativity, even if that sometimes means solving it in a way that feels like cheating. There were times my enthusiasm for Viewfinder waned a bit though. For one, while this never became as frustrating as it could have been, placing photos in such a way that transformed them into 3D environments never felt entirely predictable. Sometimes I would place a photo thinking the platform it spawns would get me to my destination, only for it to be way off, and only with a few minutes of fiddling could I figure out exactly how the game wanted me to do it. Perspective shifts in a 3D environment are a tricky thing, and while I was mostly impressed at how Viewfinder handled them with hardly any bugs or technical issues, the implementation feels about 80% there. It's fun to place pictures that shift the environment in all sorts of crazy ways, but At the same time, puzzle mechanics should feel predictable, with the challenge coming exclusively from the problem at hand and not executing the solution. It also felt like it just slightly outstayed its welcome. Viewfinder isn't a long game necessarily, at about 5 to 6 hours for the main levels and a couple more for the optional stuff, but once you get a feel for it, the main story levels are mostly pretty easy, and the new mechanics began to feel more like new inconveniences rather than elements that instilled the same sense of wonder as the first few hours did. Also, for reasons unclear to me, the last level of the game tries something a little different in the form of a tightly timed challenge, and without spoiling anything, I'll just tell you I found it very annoying and couldn't wait to turn that time challenge accessibility option on after a few failed tries. Also, while this would seem a bit of a silly knock on a puzzle game, Viewfinder tries pretty hard with its story and ends up falling pretty flat. It's clear that much effort has been put into making the world of Viewfinder feel lived in. Puzzle levels and hub worlds are filled with all sorts of personal items, food, and furniture. You play as an unnamed character who has entered a simulation of sorts to find technology that could help avert a climate catastrophe. The game's characters, who are frequently referenced but never seen, feel present through the post-it notes to one another left all over the environment and audio logs scattered throughout. You can spend a lot of time searching through everything, listening to dialogue between characters and reading their personal journal entries. You'll also spend some time being talked at by the simulation's AI, named Kate, who manifests himself as a cat, and yes, you can pet the cat. I feel that for how much care went into this story, it should work in theory but rings hollow in execution. There's plenty of dialogue in this game, but the mystery behind what this world is, what you're looking for, and why it matters is so deeply lacking in broader context and proper exposition that it feels like putting together a jigsaw puzzle of a solid blue sky. Listening to audio logs of characters excitedly explaining some technical jargon I can't possibly understand is about as interesting as listening to an eager company executive talk about leveraging the transformational capabilities of our corporate synergies to ensure our customer experience meets. Still with me? Did I lose you there? Okay, I won't pretend the audio logs are all that bad. The core plot does become less opaque over time, and actors at least do a decent job of bringing it all to life, but the lack of exposition early on definitely hurt my investment in the story, and as a result, the late game story beats never really landed. To some degree, this is a me thing. Lots of people are happy to take a vague, disjointed story and piece it together using whatever context they can find, just as some people genuinely like working on sky blue jigsaw puzzles. But if you're looking for an interesting, immersive plot that takes you from beginning to end without any kind of extra effort, it's sorely lacking there. Overall though, Viewfinder is a clever, pretty, and well-designed puzzle game that fans of the genre shouldn't sleep on. It didn't quite reach the masterpiece status for me that I had hoped it would, but is still one of the better games of its kind and has a unique, mind-bending concept that can easily captivate you enough to be worth a play. It may not be a game I remember for years to come, but if you think it's something that'll click with you, you're bound to have a pretty good time. Just make sure you come into it with the right perspective.